It's Trundle Talks. It's Trundle.
Josh and Evan. The next question, Evan and Josh, basically, I think this will go for you. What do you think are the advanced technologies that we can incorporate, and which would invocate probably better and better functional response and for better UI? This actually came from a couple of developers that I sourced these questions from.
So obviously Atlassian provides tools. Forge is a really interesting new one. It's very new, so they're still working it out. You can tell. Don't tell them. But it's a really interesting kind of paradigm. This serverless model is a very interesting paradigm, especially when working within another platform. And that's really what makes this very interesting. Is your app is running inside of another app, and there's different ways to build that out, right? So if you're going to make a dashboard gadget like VisualScript, you're kind of tied to what a dashboard gadget allows you to do, right? The kind of trick that we pull and other add-ons can pull is the use of an iframe. Okay. So you use the gadget descriptor, use the gadget JavaScript to create an iframe and behave like a gadget would behave. Once you're in the iframe context, though, you can do whatever you want, right? Now it's your little tab. You need to communicate with the parent window to get data back to the gadget, to get data back to the system, but you're in your own little world. So if you're not going to use something serverless like Forge and just use the native tools, getting into an iframe is a really clever way of kind of freeing yourself from some of the limitations. Once you're in there, it's a web page, it's a web app. So you can start to build and do things that are best practices. So if something like a Vue.js, for example, it's a great suite of tools that kind of gives you some of the benefits of React without being quite so heavy and lets you kind of declaratively define these UIs. It's a great tool. If you were building a standalone app, you might kind of start with that, right? That might be the way you're going to build your front end. For Atlassian, you really got to think about, like, this is running in an iframe in another app, right? So that's already got a lot of resources coming along. Some of your resources might be shared depending on what context you're running in. So that's where you get into what technology. Well, again, it comes back to what's the right answer for your current situation. For us, using a third-party framework wasn't the right answer. We rolled our own because of performance, because of kind of dealing with the intricacies of doing something very complex in a gadget in an iframe. We ended up rolling our own kind of framework to do that with. It was all in JavaScript and very client-side heavy. There's very little server-side code. And that's how we got performance, was doing things kind of raw, you might say. We weren't depending on a big framework that had a big bunch of overhead that made it easy to code and great for a widespread team. But for a small team like ours, they needed to have real, like, as close to native performance as we could for JavaScript. It made sense for us to build our own. That's what we did. If we weren't in that case, I would probably start with something like I'd either go serverless, do the Forge path, or I'd start with something like a Vue.js, something along those lines. I think that's just a great tool. There's a new one actually that was just a couple of weeks old called Solid. It's another great declarative framework that's really fast, really small and tight. I like Vue because you can sprinkle Vue in and around to build your UI. You can get a lot of that responsiveness and use a virtual DOM to update things. It's great for that, but it's still fairly heavy framework. You're still talking about adding a lot of code to the UI. There's benefits, but it's still decent. But yeah, that's how I build the UI probably.
Sure. Josh, you mentioned some best practices. Can you share some of the best practices for hosting an app when you're developing it for the marketplace?
Yeah. So for hosting, so if you're going to build an app that has a backend, definitely you can start with something like a node VPS, for example. You're going to get great performance, great bang for your buck, right? If you're just starting out, you're going to be small scale. That's a great way to do it. That kind of virtual hardware can be more difficult to scale. It's easier to start up with very stable in the way it performs, but if you're going to scale, now you're having to really just adding more boxes, and figuring your architecture out. I'm not a massive expert in the sense of backend architecture, but I would definitely say kind of a common best practice is using something like a AWS or an Azure, one of these kinds of infrastructure as a service providers, where auto scaling and new resources can be literally click of a button. So if you do, make it to the front page of Hacker News, you get an editor picked by Atlassian, and all of a sudden overnight you've got 10 times the users, 100 times the users. That having that ability to really scale up quickly, it's a nice option for using those backend clouds. From a code perspective, minimizing your backend, I think, is honestly a best practice, but it's something to try to consider that, if you're making tons of network calls for your app and you're making tons of network calls from your app into the platform, into JIRA or Confluence, and then making a bunch of network calls back to your services, right? And now you got data moving around. Now you got all the concerns about GDPR. It gets very complex when you start to do that. Now, obviously, if that's your use case that you need, you got to do it. But the more you can kind of keep client side, that's why Forge is such an interesting paradigm, because it's serverless, because you don't have to have a backend. And if your app can fit into that model, if you can make it work in that way, it's such a great way to go. If you can't, if you need a server side, I would, I like to minimize that. I like to keep that down to a minimum.
Sure.
It keeps things lightweight. You're not building a SaaS app, right? You're building an add-on for another platform, which is a SaaS app. So kind of keeping that to a minimum is beneficial because it lets you scale easier. It keeps your costs down in most cases. It reduces a whole bunch of other complexity that you maybe don't need when you're just starting out. If you can keep that minimum, keep the server side, serve your code up, maybe that's it. It's really helpful, I think, to get started. Asterisk, if you've got a complex app that you're building, if your idea dictates it, you're going to have to go that route. And there are people who are very good at building server and backend architectures, and that's what people, right? This is a thing people do. But that's my ideas.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. One final question, guys, and this actually I would want you to, both of you, to share your thoughts on it. How do you incorporate feedback? So let's say, for example, you already have an app running and you have it on the marketplace. I would like to ask you what practices or what checks, or how do you incorporate the feedback that you get from the users, and probably take an example and share how you're doing that for VisualScript as well.
Yeah, I can answer some of that. And so one of the things we do a lot of is talking with customers and demoing with customers. And those are very interesting conversations because, they not only give you feedback on your existing solutions that you have in place, but they also give you very interesting ideas for future things to incorporate into your backlog. Typically what we do is we take that feedback, whether it be from feedback from the marketplace, feedback from community, even whatever the case may be, and we just have a conversation about it. We have a backlog that we can put it in, and then we just have a conversation around it. What we find is if it's a really cool idea and an interesting idea, and it's fairly easy to do, we'll probably do it. But if it's something that's complex, we definitely want to gather more feedback. So we'll talk with more customers, in a best practice scenario. One example of that was interesting is we have a report called the Epic Dependency Report. And it's basically a report that shows an anchor epic and all of its epic linked issues and their dependencies at the story level. So it really gives you, like when you're doing your road mapping, it gives you just a very great view of inside of an individual feature. And one of our customers that we were talking with had a need for this. And so our engineer and I, we worked together and we came up with this solution, and they liked it. So we ended up, at this point, it was not a built-in. It was just something that we were building just for a customer, based on feedback, based on an idea, based on a need. And then we went ahead and we started demoing it as a custom solution to a lot of different people, because we wanted to know, is this something that we should incorporate in the product? And the feedback we were getting, from all these other customers was, the desire and the love for this report. And so we eventually just added it into the core product itself. Another example I'll give you too is just talking with people, we in the ITSM side, we discovered that there is a need for a timeline that helps identify the life cycle in terms of retrospective of an individual problem. And so problem to incident all the way through story development and everything. And so we built something, and we went ahead and we started showing it to customers. We got really positive feedback from it. And then we actually brought it to a conference. So we were at the Pink 20 conference in Vegas, and we were demoing all of our ITSM stuff. It's an ITSM conference, and the problem timeline got just a tremendous amount of positive feedback. So we knew we built something that customers wanted. So Joshua, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, totally agree with everything Evan said. I mean, again, it comes back to those customers, right? You got to start with the users. It's just going to be a theme. You're building an app, and tech. You need to start with who it is you're going to be serving. But Evan made a point I want to expand on, which is there are going to be a lot of great ideas.
Yeah.
There are going to be a lot of people who are going to call you up and say, "Hey, I really just need this one thing. Can you do this one thing for me?" But one of the hardest things in product management is taking all of those just one things and distilling them into the common thing. Lots of apps, and the real trick is, how do I define and build an app, build a solution that serves like a group of people?
Yeah.
Find that commonality, find that thing everybody's doing. And that's the biggest thing for us talking to users is, as Evan said, we'll talk to one and they'll go, "Oh, I really need this one obscure thing." It's like, okay, but let's now wait and let's be patient and listen before we race off and go code it up.
Yeah.
Put it in the backlog, note it, right? But let's look for the pattern. Is that person doing something completely unusual and it works for their organization and only their organization, and no one else in the world does this, right? They're a special snowflake, or is it common to other people? Is this a common pain people are feeling? And you look for those patterns. And when you find something that a number of people, and it depends on, factors like severity, right? Is this a pain that only a handful of people are feeling, but they're really feeling it? Just like finding a bug. It's going to make a big impact on them. They're a large, potential market, right? You only have 5 customers, but each one of these customers has got 300,000 users. And oh boy, do they need this thing solved, right? They need this yesterday. You raise that up. That's really good feedback, and you take it very seriously. The other end of that is maybe you've got 10 or 15 users per kind of example customer, but you've got 50, 60,000 of these 10 to 15 users, right? And they're feeling a different common pain. You look for that matrix of, how widespread is this being felt? How many people can benefit from this? Can we code it up in a way? Can we build a solution that's going to have widespread adoption? Atlassian is actually very good at this. Trello is amazing at this. Of this kind of, find that 80%. Good old Pareto principle. Find that this is going to solve it for 80% of the people, and finding that pattern is so important. And that's where user feedback, and user feedback in different platforms. The person you talk to at Summit is different than the person you talk to at something like a Pink conference, for an ITSM conference. Is different than the person you might talk to at an ACE, or there's all these different environments where you're going to get a slightly different person to talk to, a slightly different mood that they're in. Their mental space is different at that moment. And taking all of those different angles is so important. We hear lots of good ideas at Summit at one of the parties. Are you all in the best mindset in that moment, having that discussion? There's some external challenges around that, right? It's very different from, someone's just left work for the day, coming to an ACE, and you're meeting up, and it's like something's fresh on their mind, right? Both are very, very, very valid feedback. They're both important, but maybe that one fresh off the day of work is a little bit different than the one from
Sure.
and knowing that context helps as well. This is a great piece of user feedback. What was the mental model? Where was that person when they were giving this feedback? And taking that into account, because like I said, lots of great ideas. But you have to distill those into something that's really actionable and will actually make a difference for your product. And otherwise you're chasing your tail, shipping features that nobody ever uses. And you really don't want that. You want to stay focused.
I would also add to something in that when you have a product that's flexible as our product, one of the statements we say when we're talking with customers is different representations of the same data. And so the feedback we'll get often is, I love that report and I love the content it's providing, but can I see it this way? And so making sure that we're building things that can be, I want to see it as a bar chart. I want to see it as a pie chart. I want to see it as an in-context grid or things like that. As we're building these reports, identifying different ways that we can show that data, and asking questions around those to gather the feedback of what are maybe the best 2 ways to do it. Then we can go from there. Because from our perspective, we want to we like the product so much that we just want to see every possible way we can build something. But like Joshua said, it goes back to the customer and the majority. And so as our technology matures in our product too, then we might be able to do like some proof of concepts and show that. We're very big into talking with people at ACES just about Atlassian and understanding where their pain points are, and then what's the best way that their management wants to see something.
Thank you so much, Evan and Joshua, for coming to the podcast. It was amazing talking to you, and thank you for all the wisdom that you shared with us for the app development. I'm pretty sure a lot of developers would, be really thankful for the inputs that you guys have shared.
Thank you so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks
guys. Have a good day. Stay safe.
Take care. You too.